Hello.
Ah, so, well, we'll see if other people join.
Yeah.
What's new? What do you want to talk about?
Yeah, I'm kind of at a loss. I had jotted some things down, but they're like voice. I still don't really understand voice, but
hmm
but I don't know that that's.
Well, we can talk about it. Do you
Okay.
have a more specific question?
Well, I guess, I had thought I thought in terms of the voice referring to the narrator's voice.
hmm
But then, oh, I forget, you were interviewing someone, I think, and it was in one of those interviews that they seem to be more talking about you as the author, the voice of the piece somehow as a whole reflecting your voice as an author.
Right.
So I don't.
Well, both of what you said are correct. So, um, the narrative or the narrative voice is the author's voice as expressed in that piece. So if you're writing fiction and you've got the invisible narrator or the authorial narrator, one that does not have a persona,
Right.
you know, then the author's voice and the narrative voice are one and the same in the context of that piece. If you're talking about someone's oeuvre, then they might have an author's voice that you can distinguish from piece to piece, but then within each individual voice, they might um, get more, shape that voice more to suit the particular story.
Okay, could you say more about that in the sense of how is a voice what would a voice that suited a story well, how would it sound
Mm-hmm.
different from a voice that you might say, it's an interesting voice or something like that, but it doesn't suit your story? What would that mean?
Well, all right. Let's see if I can come at it from this angle. So, if I'm looking at my own voice as an author, I use a lot of detail. I use a lot of narrative exposition. I do a lot of
Oh,
description in
oh,
my novels, right? And in my historical novels, I do all of those things, but I'm going into the 19th century or the early 20th century. And so I'm doing those things with my ear tuned to what would be appropriate in that period, yet for today's readers. So my narrative and my historical work might feel more formal than in something like Skog or even a stone's throw. I just blanked on my own title for a second. I'm like, that one. Right. So, and if I'm going for like Skog Hall, the murder mystery, I might want it to have a tighter, more tense feel to it, right? Because it's a suspense
mm-hmm,
genre.
mm-hmm.
So while I still use exposition and I still do description and I still do a lot with setting, the prose that does those things will take on a slightly different tone than in a stone's throw, which is much more introspective and dealing with life issues, specifically women and motherhood and having children and loss and grief and all that kind of stuff. Um, so if I were writing, to go to the appropriate piece, if I were writing Skog Hall with the same voice I used for my historical fiction, it would be jarring. It would feel disjointed, right? I wouldn't write Skog Hall with a formal, old fashioned sounding narrative. It would ruin the suspense.
Okay, so and there's an issue I've also wondered about that somehow it seems sort of akin to this because it has to do with language and adapting the level of language, the level of vocabulary. I'm thinking in particular of when you have a child who is a character. And what I thought I had read some time ago was that even, of course, in the child's dialogue, you want the kid to sound like a kid, but
Right.
that even beyond that, you maybe don't want the narrative voice to be at a vocabulary level too far removed from the child's. I mean,
Well, who is the narrator? Is it a first person?
no, no.
Okay.
No, it's not like Room,
Right.
where everything has to be right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you want to distinguish between your narrator and your perspective in that case. So your narrator is authorial, invisible to the reader. So your narrator will be, let's just say it's you, and whatever voice you want to tell this story in. It's not a fairy tale. It's not for an audience of 8-year-olds. It's for an audience of adult readers, right?
Right.
So you are going to shape your authorial voice for that audience, and you will describe your action and your setting and even the child's thoughts in that voice. But when you are showing us what the child notices, thinks, and feels, that's when, using that voice, you are going to relate everything through the eyes of a child, through the perspective of a child. So it's not that your vocabulary becomes childish, but it's that you hone in on what that child notices and how and why and how the child responds. So that's where the close third really gets powerful, right?
Right.
So some of your vocabulary might shift because that's the best way to convey that child's perspective, but you don't dumb it down, right? It's not speaking like a child, it's conveying the child's perspective.
Right. And isn't there a kind of famous short story in which a physician goes to help deliver a baby in we call them Indians then, an Indian camp, and the husband is experiencing, they had a name for it, like he was going through childbirth, like his wife.
Oh, the sympathetic pregnancy thing? Yeah.
And the little boy who accompanies his father, who's the doctor, they show the story through his viewpoint. And the shock at the end of, there's this shocking thing at the end of the story, and it's particularly shocking because of how the child has misinterpreted things.
Oh, right.
That's a good example of.
Do you know who wrote that? Or
I'll have to, hopefully it will come back to me.
Yeah.
It's decades ago that I got a very powerful story, but I think it used to be kind of a classic one that could have even been in high school readers, literature books, and that may be why it's different. But
I would like to read that. So
I will definitely. It's amazing what I can find sometimes by just Googling certain key concepts. So I'll see about that. So staying a little bit with language and formality, I guess it is also partly with voice. When I know how to write what people call the King's English. But I found myself straying further and further from that because it didn't seem to me to fit something. It seemed to me that it would distract the reader from, not so much exactly from the story, but it wouldn't jive with the character who was being featured in that. And I have looked at some authors whom I really like and who do employ the King's English. And
Right.
it doesn't jar me, but it may be partly because I'm used to them, so that even though their books are set in modern day time, and I'm thinking of people like Ruth Rendell, who writes psychological suspense and often has both working class characters and I forget what they call it in England when someone's speaking.
Oh, like the Cockney?
Yes, Cockney,
Uh-huh.
and yet her sentence structure is impeccable. You know, she
Right.
never end a sentence with a preposition and stuff like that. So,
Right.
what do you think about all that, and how? You know, I don't know if I'm being too easy on myself and kind of being lazy, or
Mm.
because what I sometimes do is I put it in the King's English and then it sounds so off, I simply try to rewrite the whole thing in a way where I can avoid the problem.
Mm-hmm.
But what do you think?
Well, when you say it sounds off, do you mean things like ending with a preposition and dangling participles and that kind of thing? Or is it the
No,
voice itself sounds wrong?
the voice itself sounds wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Oh, I see what you're saying. Right. No, in fact, and it isn't usually a dangling, preposition, but it's
Right.
something, instead of saying the door through which he came, it might be the most proper, but he came through the other door or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Just sounds to fit more.
Right. Well, so when we read a story, we enter into that world and we meet it where it exists. So that might be why reading someone like Ruth Rendell doesn't disturb you. It's like when you watch a BBC show, like Masterpiece or Mystery.
Right.
Your ear tunes into their accent and their diction, and it feels natural after a couple of minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So we're meeting that where it exists and we're happy to do so. But when you are in your own story world, if it feels off to you, it's probably because you're moving into a more formal territory than your characters would inhabit.
Right.
As a narrator. And it feels better to have your narrative voice be more similar to your characters' level of speaking and relating to each other, and you are in a close third, so there's also that closeness of narrative distance and the character's perspective that we expect as readers. If you had more emotional distance in your third person point of view, it might feel better to be a little more formal with your narrative voice.
Right. Oh, that makes a lot of sense. That's very helpful.
Good.
Yeah. Right, because you're right. Oh, good. Oh, good. Okay.
Right.
All right. So you said you had a sample of something we could look at?
Oh, yeah. So something I thought that might be fun to talk about, and I don't know how much this applies to you and your writing personally, but something I see a lot is writers use too much information in their sentences, especially when describing movements, right? So there's a sentence here that I pulled out of something. Julie covered her mouth with her right hand. Margot's shoulders dropped slightly and her head moved forward, eyes widening slightly at Bill. Right?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, so when people micromanage the characters' physical movements on the page, you lose fluidity of movement. It's harder for the reader to actually visualize what's happening, because instead of seeing somebody do this, you see the hand lifted across the face, and then the chin tilted, and then the hand touched the forehead, and then, right? And so it's sort of like taking a movie and stuttering it.
Yeah.
Instead of just showing the action when writers do that. And then you also lose the meaning. There's no emotional impact. There's no charge to a description like that, because we get hung up on on the details, on the minutiae. Right.
Yeah.
Yes. And you're trying to see where it is going. What am I concerned with? Am I concerned with the mouth or the shoulders or the head or the eyes or Bill? You know, it's kind of like, what? So that was,
Yeah.
yeah.
A while back, well, you were you were telling me it would be nice if I had more description of the physical aspects of my characters, that they don't even have bodies, some of them that you can picture, or you can just make it totally up because you have no clue.
Right.
And so at that point, besides trying to pay more attention to watching people, you know, in different kinds of settings, I found a really interesting setting is wherever you have to wait, like to get your oil changed, or, you know, cars.
Oh, yeah.
All kinds of different people that
Yes.
I really probably wouldn't be in the same room with. We don't share enough. So I studied some of those people. That was interesting. But then I also had the idea, and this got me right into the problem that you're describing, of just standing in front of the mirror, and particularly with different expressions, and then trying to study how my own face changed. And that led me right into the minutia.
Yes, it does, doesn't it?
Yes. So I realized later when then you catch, well, at least I was catching that when I had some time away from that particular scene and went back, I would be thinking, what? You don't need all this. And now that I'm going and this kind of final pass at this point through the manuscript that I'll be sending you, I see, I think of it as tightening it up. I see quite a few times where either one of those descriptions of maybe the person's voice, maybe their expression, a sudden movement they make, either one of the two would be sufficient. And having two does not add, it somehow takes away.
It does, exactly. Yeah, and I find as a reader the best descriptions are similes and metaphors, and when they're really fresh and unexpected, that's when they get me, and those are, I think some people just have a gift for that, and others of us, myself included, struggle with that. But even if you aren't finding those metaphors and similes, there's a happy medium between going completely abstract with the metaphor and then micromanaging the description, as in these sentences. And the key is to find what's important in that moment. What is really relevant here? Is it the jaw-dropping shock, or is it the glare of anger, or is it, what is the element about that physical expression or movement that conveys meaning?
Yes.
Right. And the meaning is not found in a listing of details. It's found in one key element.
Yeah.
It might be in the rapidity of movement, like spinning sharply around, or the noise of slamming the door or whatever.
Yeah.
The grit teeth. But it's not in choreography.
Yeah, I think what I'm starting to get better at too is this problem I have of this inclination to over-explain. And I used to, once my son had pointed it out, which was a long time ago, I saw it in terms of kind of very gross factors, like that I shouldn't be saying she was angry, she slammed her fist on the table.
Right.
But now, as I've gone back to when you've commented and pointed out that I'm explaining, it's how do I want to put this? It's not quite that glaring, and I don't catch it until a second or even sometimes a third read.
Yeah.
But the more that I'm catching it, the more I'm seeing it. And sometimes now I'm just on this pass through, I get to something and I think, is that over explaining, or or really isn't that just kind of supporting the narrative voice? And then sometimes now I just delete it and see if it really changes anything. Do I really think
Yeah.
the reader won't know what's going on without that? And most of the time I think, no, I mean, it doesn't matter that it's not there. So then I decided that
Right.
maybe my test for if I was over explaining.
Uh-huh.
And it's interesting because the other thing I was doing that you made me aware of is, at other times it wasn't clear to you, where is this person? What is this setting? And I was trying not to over explain. But now, I mean, it's a really interesting process. This whole thing is an interesting process. But especially this tendency I realize I have to not totally get what it is you're trying to show me, then thinking I know and overcorrecting for it.
Right.
And then having to go back. So I started paying attention to that in some of the novels that I'm reading and seeing that sometimes, in fact, there's a lot of detail, as in your books, to get that setting clear.
Yeah.
And when it's done well, it does something else, like creating mood or,
Right.
So
Right.
it isn't just sterile. And
Yeah.
that's kind of like, that's fine. That's not over explaining. It's when I try to throw in these, like, will the reader get that she did that out of pride or something? Or
Right.
And on the other hand, when you're doing a close third, so I still have to capture the difference between, I guess now that I'm thinking about it, it's letting the reader in to the character's experience in great detail and with some build-up to a climactic point. And that's more like a detailed description that has mood, that is doing something else than just describing.
Right. Yeah, you're hitting on so many great things as you've been talking here. I love that you're deleting stuff and seeing if you lose meaning by deleting it. Yeah, that is such a great test. And, if somebody slams their fist on the table, you can bet they're angry or frustrated or irritated, right? You know what category that fits into. If somebody lifts a chin and straightens up their spine, they might be indignant or they might be proud, but we have that context. So we're going to understand the gesture just as we would if we were with a physical person and we saw them do that, right? We would get it.
Right.
Yeah. Oh gosh, now they're all leaving my head, but you hit on like 4 or 5 things that I thought were great. Oh, I know. So setting, you mentioned using detail, and the key again is relevance. So is this a setting a reader really needs to have a map of? Like when I was doing Skog Hall, it's a haunted house story. So I really needed my reader to get a sense of this house. But if your characters, like Jess was in a library basement looking at microfiche, broad brush strokes are fine. So you don't want to bog down your manuscript in detail for absolutely everything. Right. There's a sliding scale of what you need to do. So at the bare minimum, make sure the reader has a sense of place, so that the actors aren't on a bare stage. It's not experimental theater.
Right.
Yeah.
So I feel really good about what I'm learning, how much I'm learning. So
yeah, and you have learned a ton.
Yeah, I really feel I have. I think it's it's so hard to be objective about your own work. So I'm telling myself, you really have learned a lot, but you don't know what you don't know. You don't know where. That's why I said that in the note to you about levels. I don't know what else is there to pay attention to get this work to the level that I would, well, not the level I was going to say that I would want it to be, but I think of it more as the very best level that I'm capable of writing.
Right. Yes.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
that's satisfying. That would be my,
Sure.
my satisfaction with it. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's the best end goal. Because if you get it as good as you can get it, and then you still think it needs more, you're probably going to feel like you're hitting your head against a wall, right? So
Right.
That's when you either say it's good enough to put out in the world, or I'm going to rest it, do other projects, grow, and come back to it.
Back to it, yeah.
Right.
I remember at one writers' conference I went to, one of the speakers said they were a little bit, their narrative voice was a little bit caustic.
Oh, wow.
But she was good too. But one of the things she said was kind of something like, the problem with you all, it wasn't quite that caustic, was that you want to write the 5th book.
Yes.
And you want to write it first.
Yeah, yeah.
and that really stuck with me. I thought, that's exactly right. And I don't even mind if I have to write 4 books to get to it, but I want to write.
Yeah. Yes.
So
I get that.
yeah. So, okay. All right.
Good.
I don't have a lot else. I had other thoughts, but I wondered about, I guess I don't know when do I get outside the, lines of what you would want to address in these kinds of discussions. But I have been thinking more about things like Kirkus reviews. Are they worth getting? The next steps that have more to do with marketing and all that. So I was curious about your opinion, but then if you don't really want to address those kinds of things, that's okay.
Yeah, I don't know that I have an opinion about something like Kirkus reviews. Marketing is tough and time consuming, and it can be expensive. Same with contests. So and that's not my area of expertise.
Okay.
I'm happy to chat a bit, but I wouldn't want to say, here's advice.
Right.
My expertise is in the developmental editing and craft camp.
Sure. Yeah, I do understand that.
Yeah.
I was when you had us in the writing class, in the character development class, you had us look at the blurbs and things.
Mm-hmm.
We were mainly doing it to notice the extent to which theme was being emphasized versus plot.
Right. Yeah.
And that was very useful to see that variety.
Mm-hmm.
But it also made me start thinking about how if you have some positive statements from someone, it's probably helpful to put at the kind of top of, there's that space that seems to be devoted.
Right. Yes.
So
yeah, that helps. I think what is it? So buyers see the thumbnail, so your cover is critical. Once they get to your sales page, there's the description of the book. And I think one of the big names in the indie world, and now I'm totally blanking on all said names, but I think he said the blurb was the most important thing. Like before the cover, he did a survey. Nick Stevenson, it might have been him. I'm not 100% positive on that, but he found more people bought because of the book description. Technically, it's not a blurb, but we all call it that. Right. So the cover has to be eye-catching enough to get them from the thumbnail to the description. But the description is what matters most. And then, of course, your reviews, your social proof.
Right.
I would say that's close, factors fairly highly, because it's, you might like a description, but we also all know that descriptions can be hired out,
Right.
right?
Right.
So there might be a great description, but then if it's a bunch of 1 and 2 star reviews,
Right. Yeah. Right. Right.
The other thing, like personally, I use Look Inside all the time on
me
those
too.
books.
Yes.
So if I read a first page
Yeah.
and it, you know,
Doesn't grab us. Right. Right.
yeah, or if the writing looks like it isn't solid or it looks poorly edited, you know, done.
Mhm.
So yeah, it all counts. I think personally, and this is not advice, but my opinion is that things like Kirkus reviews or ads are more important if you're in the traditional ring because you're marketing to booksellers, to brick and mortar stores, right? But if you're going indie, then it's more of a personal transaction between you and the reader. So whatever you get up on Amazon to represent your book, that's what they see. You know, they're going off of the also bots, or we're recommending this to you because you read that other book.
Right.
This is in your favorite genre. So Amazon is doing all of this recommendation stuff.
Right.
Those readers aren't going to a newspaper and shopping based on, you know, those reviews, or they aren't walking into a brick and mortar store and looking for, you know, this employee recommends this book and here's a handwritten sentence.
Right. Right.
Right.
Right.
So, yeah,
Okay.
it's tough to know where to put your energy and your dollars when you get to that side of the publishing hump.
I have a little bit of experience in marketing. Quite a few years ago, I invented a word game, and they actually use the same words. They talk about self-publishing, use the same vocabulary, and I decided to self-publish it. And I learned more about business than I ever wanted to know. I mean, I went to the library for books on how to trademark, you know, the name and how to copyright. You actually copyright games. Instructions. You know, so, but it was a tremendous amount of work, and so I learned enough to know that it's a tremendous amount of work, and it can be very time consuming, and you do want to think carefully about where you put your dollars and your time. So
well, I think that's great training for what you're going to end up doing for your book.
Yes, I think so too. Okay. All right. Well, I don't have anything else on my mind today.
All right. Well, it's good to see you.
Good to see you too. So I'll be hearing from you because you're going to send me.
Yes, I am.
Okay. All right. Yep. Pretty soon I'll be done with this last pass through, I think. And
okay. Sounds good.
Send you something. Thanks, Alita.
Great. You're welcome. You too. All right. Bye.